This is the National Broadcasting Company.
Hey everyone, I'm Simone, and tonight on Signal, President Trump sounds off in an Oval Office Q&A. Then Steve Bullock thinks he could be the next president. But how to run when you're a relative unknown? And Colin Kaepernick's attorney has some harsh words for the NFL commissioner. But first, we can confirm that it is freezing here in New York, and we don't have it nearly as bad as parts of the Midwest. Now, some people, including President Trump, think these cold temperatures and global warming are mutually exclusive. So we brought in David Cantor, he's a professor of environmental studies at NYU, to explain how a polar vortex actually works and what, if anything, it means for climate change.
So the Midwest and East Coast have been hit by extremely cold temperatures this week, and they're being blamed on the polar vortex. Chicago was hit with a low this morning of -21. Cedar Rapids, Iowa was at -30. And over on the East Coast, Boston was at -5 Fahrenheit. So what is the polar vortex? Well, it's this mass of really cold air that's stuck over the Arctic, held there by really strong winds. But sometimes what happens is that polar vortex splits up, and that cold air that was stuck over the Arctic gets moved south into the actual continental United States. Similarly, a mass of hot air moves northward. And so what that does is it disrupts those winds, the polar jet stream, that actually keeps the Arctic super cold in winter. So these extreme cold temperatures led the president to tweet, "What the hell is going on with global warming? Please come back fast, we need you." Now this misunderstands the basic difference between weather and climate. Weather is when you go outside, you feel what temperature it is. Climate is that weather averaged over decades, and we have decades of observations showing that the climate is warming. The last 4 years were the warmest on record. As we're experiencing these extreme cold, record-breaking temperatures here in the United States, at the same time in Australia, they have record-breaking heat waves. New research also suggests a warming climate could actually lead to more of these polar vortex events. And that's because the Arctic is actually warming 2 to 3 times quicker than the rest of the planet. And as it does that, the winds that usually keep the really cold air around the Arctic weaken. And it weakens the jet stream that leads to slippage of the cold air, more likely into places like the East Coast and the Midwest, and into parts of Europe as well. So to summarize, Arctic warming leads to a weaker jet stream, which leads to more extreme winters. Climate change is all about extremes. And right now, we're seeing twice the number of heat extremes to cold extremes. So long story short, this super cold weather we're experiencing right now is due to the polar vortex. And that polar vortex could actually be made worse and more frequent because of climate change. So this idea that global warming or climate change is going to come to the rescue, save us from these cold weather extremes, is not true. We're going to see more extremes as the climate continues to warm. There are going to be more hot extremes, but we're still going to see some cold extremes as well.
Well, President Trump took questions in the Oval Office earlier this afternoon, and once again, he contradicted America's top intelligence officials on security issues like ISIS, North Korea.
No, I disagree with certain things that they said. I think I'm right, but time will prove that. Time will prove me right, probably.
Now, the president was also asked about the wall, and he's holding his ground, saying he won't approve any deal that doesn't include wall funding. But the definition of his desired barrier between the U.S. and Mexico hasn't been entirely consistent.
Steel slats. I've made my position very clear. If I build a steel wall rather than a concrete wall, it will actually be stronger than a concrete. Steel is stronger than concrete. If you don't have a strong steel or concrete barrier, there's no way you're going to stop these people from rushing. Walls should not be controversial. If we don't put up a physical barrier, you can forget it.
An NBC News Wall Street Journal poll found that support for a border wall among Americans, regardless of party, has gone down over the last 13 years. And the same poll found that Trump's approval rating was at 43%, his disapproval rating 54%. So we were wondering how this compares to past presidents when they were 2 years into their first terms. Steve Kornacki is the network's numbers guy.
All right, Simone, well, here we go. Another State of the Union address. And, of course, everybody wants to know, we're always asking, what is the political health of the president right now, and how does it look for him heading into 2020? The campaign's already begun on the Democratic side. Well, here you see the bottom line. We're always tracking the approval rating for Donald Trump. And here, heading into this State of the Union address, the most recent Gallup poll, he's sitting there, 37% approval, 59% disapproval. You know, there's been that range that he's kind of been in as president, somewhere in the high 30s on a bad day, the low to mid 40s on a good day. He really hasn't deviated from that range, but lately, probably because of the shutdown, he has been at the bottom end of the range. Here's the question, though. How does this compare? Take a look at all of his predecessors, modern presidents at this point, heading into the end of January, sort of the State of the Union for them the year before their election. How does Trump compare? Well, here you go. You get a good sense of it. At this point, the highest modern number, 83% George Bush Sr. Of course, at this point in his presidency, the country was at war. Operation Desert Storm, early 1991, so no surprise he had the highest number there. George W. Bush, his son, remember that was just months after the 9/11 attacks, excuse me, this was about a year after the 9/11 attacks, heading into the Iraq War in 2003, so those two were the highest. But you see Trump at 37%. It's not a good number for any president, obviously heading into a re-election campaign. What he can take solace in is the only one lower than him, Ronald Reagan, at this point in 1983, when unemployment was through the roof still, did win re-election easily. Clinton also, he was higher than Trump, but not that great. Obama as well at 50%. They both won re-election. So things can change in the next year and a half. The challenge for Trump has just been he has been stuck in that range. You haven't seen him budge past the mid-40s basically his entire presidency. Does he need to get it a little higher than that to have a chance at re-election, or could he win just by somehow dragging down his opponent? The other question I'm always asking, too, is with numbers like this, is there any threat in his own party? You're starting to hear some noise. Larry Hogan, the governor of Maryland, Bill Weld, former governor of Massachusetts from like 2 decades ago, he's making rumblings about challenging Trump in the Republican primaries next year. Is Trump at all vulnerable when it comes to his own party? And we can show you these are, again, the modern presidents, their support within their own parties at this point in their presidency. Trump, though, that 88% with Republicans. 88% say they approve of his job performance. Again, you look at some of the other here. Jimmy Carter actually got a primary challenge in 1980 from Ted Kennedy. Carter survived, but it was a damaging primary challenge. That 88% tells you there may not be that great of an appetite in the Republican Party for a primary challenge to Donald Trump. So that becomes the dilemma Republicans are sort of facing, if you strategically, if you want to call it that. At this point, doesn't look like Trump's in much danger of losing the Republican nomination, but with an approval rating like this at 37%, that is historically, and we saw him in 2016 with terrible numbers get elected president by a very, very narrow margin there. These numbers are suggesting he's going to have to do the same thing again to win a second term in 2020.
So basically every day we're hearing about someone new jumping into the 2020 race. There are the announcements we've already seen, announcements we're assuming we'll see, and then there are some other names in the mix you might not know yet. NBC's Vaughn Hilliard went out west to spend the day with one of them.
Governor Steve Bullock.
Don't kid yourself. The threats are real. We have to continue to build up our voices, to be even louder.
How do you become president when most of America doesn't even know who you are? I first heard about Steve Bullock last summer. Alrighty, test. 1, 2, 3. Some folks in Iowa told me to pay attention to him for the 2020 presidency. He was a different type of candidate than they'd seen before.
I got reelected in 2016 in Montana. President Trump won the state by 20 points.
He doesn't have the decades of name recognition like Donald Trump, or the money, or the political clout of other Democrats in the 2020 field.
Nearly 30 leading Democrats are said to be considering a run against President Trump.
But it's the root of what made him a success back home, and that's why we're here. Could a Montana man win the Democratic nomination and then take on a New Yorker, President Donald Trump?
This is a community that I was raised in. I delivered newspapers, the governor's house as a kid. I've been able to do progressive things in this state. And yeah, 25 to 30% of my voters voted for Donald Trump. When you look at the dysfunction that's occurring in Washington, D.C., Montana and Montanans have typically figured out a way to kind of rise above that dysfunction, still make government work.
Bullock has not officially joined the race yet, But he hasn't exactly come out of nowhere. For most presidential candidates, it's about laying the groundwork. Elizabeth Warren, Kirsten Gillibrand, Kamala Harris all visited Iowa in the first week of declaring their 2020 candidacies. But that's nothing new for Bullock. He's already visited the state 4 times in just the last year. And this is exactly how a long-shot Democratic governor ended up winning the whole thing before.
Jimmy who?
I don't know who he is. I heard he was a peanut farmer.
Carter changed the game in Iowa. He roamed small towns and built a hardy coalition. He bested the other candidates in the caucus and was suddenly relevant. And then 16 years later, there was another relatively unknown governor, this one from Arkansas.
Clinton has 0 foreign policy experience. But the bigger question is whether he'll be perceived as too moderate by the liberal activists who dominate the primary process.
Sound familiar? Governor Bullock currently represents one of the country's most rural places. Just look at the 2016 race by county. The Democratic nominee suffered across rural America. So why do Montanans like him?
Well, I think he does communicate well with ranchers and folks that you would think of as, on the average, being very conservative voters.
When I tell you Steve Bullock, and potential candidate for president of the United States, you tell me.
Holy shit, really? Yeah, wow.
Do you think he could take on Donald Trump?
No, I don't think so. Trump is a little bit of a bulldozer, you know, he's powerful guy.
For a guy new to the national scene, Bullock still has much to answer. Does he support Medicare for all? U.S. troop presence in the Middle East? As governor, he has expanded Medicaid, called for universal background checks, and a ban on assault weapons. He's also been a strong public lands advocate for Montana.
The president does not understand the value of our public lands, and an attack on public lands anywhere is an attack on public lands everywhere.
You can't shake the hands or listen to every voter, but you can actually demonstrate by showing up in places, talking about things that matter around, you know, a kitchen table or the bar after shift.
Can I ask you about the idea of this guy running for president?
Excellent. Perfect. He'd be perfect. As long as your wife's on board, you can do that.
I appreciate that.
While he might have the votes at the bar in Montana, it's still a long time before the first official caucus. How do you run against Donald Trump?
I think that if anybody thinks the job is to out-Trump Trump, I think they're boldly mistaken. I think I can certainly stand up to him and offer something better.
All right, now here are your headlines briefly. In an exclusive story breaking right now from NBC News, we've learned that if the U.S. pulls out of Syria, the military thinks ISIS could regain territory in 6 to 12 months. That's according to a Pentagon draft report. It says ISIS is intent on regaining territory. Now, this, of course, follows President Trump's announcement in December that the U.S. military would be leaving Syria, and he tweeted that ISIS had been defeated. The Defense Department and the National Security Council declined to comment on the report. And there was a record-breaking drug bust at a border checkpoint in Arizona. Customs and Border Protection say they discovered 254 pounds of fentanyl hidden in a floor compartment of a tractor-trailer. That truck was loaded with cucumbers. Now, fentanyl is that synthetic opioid blamed for a majority of overdose deaths. A drug-sniffing dog actually tipped off the officials as the truck was trying to enter the U.S. Authorities say this is the largest seizure of fentanyl in U.S. history, and it's valued at $3.5 million. Now, they also found 395 pounds or $1.1 million worth of methamphetamine. Authorities said the truck driver was a 26-year-old man who's been arrested and charged with possession with the intent to distribute drugs. All right, Twitter and Facebook today said they removed thousands of accounts tied to foreign governments, including Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, that were spreading disinformation in the run-up to the 2018 midterm elections. Twitter said the Russian operation used the same tactics it used in 2016 when it tried to influence the election in favor of Donald Trump, but that the efforts were less successful this time around. So Facebook worked with Twitter to take down about 800 accounts from Iran. They were posing as American local news outlets both on Instagram and Facebook. Now, Twitter also said it removed about 6,000 posts from U.S.-based troll accounts that were spreading misinformation on things like when and how to vote. And there's a war brewing in Silicon Valley. Apple hit back at Google today for violating its privacy rules after it did the same thing to Facebook yesterday. So Apple appears to have blocked what are known as enterprise apps for Google. Those are apps that employees use internally for work purposes. It was retaliation for Google blatantly violating Apple's privacy policies with a cache for data research program. So it's more or less the same thing that happened to Facebook yesterday. Now, the companies were allegedly paying users, some as young as 13 years old, to download tracking apps that followed private messages, photos, emails, and web searches, then sent the data back to Facebook and Google's servers. Both companies say they're working to fix the problem. And those are your headlines, briefly. We'll be right back in 30 seconds.
We are going to start with something different tonight. This is one of those things that you have not been otherwise hearing about in the news, but stick with me.
Feed your mind with fresh perspective. Get your favorite MSNBC shows now as podcasts.
The topics we cover on MSNBC every day, they're driven by big ideas, big themes, huge societal changes. And that's what we talk about on our new podcast. It's called Why Is This Happening?
Why Is This Happening with Chris Hayes. New episodes every Tuesday.
Should we trust AI? I mean, it's kind of everywhere, from recommendation algorithms on Netflix to self-driving cars. Yesterday, the United Nations issued a report saying over half of all AI patents have been filed in the last 5 years alone. They're calling it a quantum leap in AI research. So we're asking the question, should this be regulated? I had a chat with Lindsay Cormack. She's the director of the Diplomacy Lab at Stevens Institute of Technology. And Jacob Ward, he's a tech correspondent with us here at NBC News. So we started with opening arguments. They had 15 seconds for or against. Then we talked through the details a bit. Okay, Lindsay, we're going to start with you. Should artificial intelligence be federally regulated?
Artificial intelligence holds tremendous potential in a variety of industries. Right now, the U.S. Congress doesn't hold the requisite expertise to craft regulations that would not be unduly burdensome and stifle innovation. It's also really important to think about the global context. Both our allies and our adversaries are keen on developing AI, and neither...
That was so good, though. Within the time that you had, that was very impressive. All right, Jacob, same question to you. 15 seconds. Should AI be federally regulated?
Yes, it absolutely should be. And that's because artificial intelligence is basically poised to pick up all the patterns of our lives, and potentially it allows us to sort of amplify those patterns and manipulate one another on the basis of them. Right now, it's not exactly clear what form that regulation should take, but there are lots of examples from other places where you could do it.
Okay. One of the big things that we talk about a lot on this topic is the idea that robots will basically become better at humans at every kind of job. How concerned do you guys think humans should be about losing their jobs to AI? Jacob?
Well, I would definitely say that any job that involves pattern recognition, picking up a pattern is going to be either augmented by or replaced by AI. We're seeing this.
Give me some examples.
So let's talk about, the medical industry. Right now, an oncologist looking at a picture of a mole on your back, trying to figure out if it's cancerous, can instead hand that off to software that's just come out that'll look at millions of other pictures and say, okay, based on what we know of it, the pattern here is, yes, this is cancerous, or no, it is not. That kind of thing works incredibly well. And so are we going to need all of those, lab techs who do those kinds of readings? I don't think so, not in the future.
Computers are better at pattern recognition. They will be better at diagnosing people, and the world will be better for it. Does that mean we don't have doctors? No. It means that they shift their scope in what they're doing, and we have more people getting treated earlier, living better, healthier lives. So I don't think it's something to fear.
So taking into consideration everything that we've talked about here today, Lindsay, what do you think effective AI regulation would look like, both from the government and from the tech companies that are creating it?
So I think a lot of it will have to be application-based. So we can have regulations that say if drones identify this is a body of people where there might be a suspect that we need to think about taking out, that's something that the computer doesn't make the final decision. A human should make the final decision. That sort of application-specific regulation is totally possible, and you don't need to know the ins and outs of AI to create that sort of regulation.
Artificial intelligence is the first truly revolutionary technology that's going to change everybody's lives that is entirely happening within the private sector. It's inside companies that have have to obey essentially no rules whatsoever. And so for me, the real concern here is you combine the power that those companies are going to have, the lack of regulation that they have on them, and the capacity for influencing society, democracy, everything about our way of life. Somebody's got to put some guardrails around that kind of activity.
See, and I don't actually think that's quite the case. Like, existing laws do govern things that AI can be used for. So, like end results for automated vehicles and stuff. There are existing state laws and federal regulations that kind of limit these things. So while we don't have good regulations on the black box algorithms and we don't necessarily know what's making those decisions, the end results still do have governance around them.
I agree with you in the cases where those end results are the sort of edge cases, military usages or people's safety behind the wheel of an automatic car, that kind of thing. What I'm worried about is there is a subtler kind of human influence that we are just starting to see. So I'll give you an example. Remember that United Airlines flight where the guy was dragged off the flight out of Chicago, right? He was
all over social media.
All over social media, right? And United got all this blame for it. Well, here's what actually happened. His name got chosen by a computer, but that guy said, nope, I'm not leaving. I'm staying on this flight. They called in security guards and said to him, this guy's name has been pulled off of a computer. Go and do this. Now, I've been talking to all these psychologists who study anthropomorphism, the tendency we have to give computers more weight than they deserve. And they've shown that it basically short circuits your decision-making system when you're told that a name comes out of a computer. And as a result, I think we all are in a position where once these AI-driven results come at us, we're going to make all kinds of weird decisions we don't even know about.
Okay, so I know where you guys both stand right now. Jacob, you are for. Lindsay, you are against regulation. But now we're going to change things up. We call this part of the show Switching Sides, where we push really smart people out of their comfort zones to confront their own biases. So we're going to have you swap sides.
I love it.
Jacob, from the opposing view, should AI be regulated?
Okay, absolutely not. There's no question that it should be absolutely left open. I mean, one thing is the private sector has created incredible innovations that the public sector really can't anymore. You know, that you don't have enough well-paid STEM people in the public sector to even fuel the kinds of breakthrough innovations that we've seen out of the private sector. So yeah, you know, maybe we need companies to just go and make it happen.
Lindsay, I'm going to flip it over to you now that you're on the other side.
Yeah, I think we absolutely should regulate AI. There's a lot of privacy concerns, and individual consumers don't even know what they put out there and how it's going to be used. Like when you think about talking to Alexa and how Alexa's getting smarter and understanding intonation, if we don't regulate private sector usage of this, they will use it for whatever they like. And we can't control those ends. We might not agree what those ends should be, but we should have some contours of regulations kind of guiding companies, or at least putting limits on what they can do with this sort of information.
That was scary convincing and
She's
a scary
good. She turned me around.
And a scary conversation too. Lindsay, Jacob, thank you so much. Really fascinating conversation about the future there. Okay, but back to the president. In a press conference on Wednesday, NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell offered an explanation as to why Colin Kaepernick isn't playing football.
I think if a team decides that Colin Kaepernick or any other player can help their team win, that's what they'll do. They want to win, and they make those decisions individually in the best interest of their club.
Kaepernick's lawyer, Mark Garagos, fired back this morning in an exclusive interview on Today.
The collusion actually was the NFL kowtowing to the president. I mean, it's clear. I think the evidence will show that when we do the hearing, and it's been admitted pretty much publicly by a number of the owners.
So Kaepernick first kneeled in protest in 2016. Other players began following suit, but this didn't sit well with plenty of NFL fans, including President Trump, who considered kneeling during the anthem as a sign of disrespect toward U.S. service members. But Cap has plenty of supporters, and those supporters have been encouraging halftime performers like Maroon 5, Travis Scott, and Big Boy to boycott the big game in solidarity. Now, regardless, millions of Americans will be watching as the Patriots take on the Rams. Look, sports permeate our culture, and America's obsession has driven athletes higher, faster, and stronger, which has changed the nature of sports and the athletes themselves. Our friends over at NBC's Left Field have more.
Athletes on TV these days seem to be from another planet compared to their predecessors. Around 60% of Americans describe themselves as sports fans.
And of the athletes we're watching, they're changing. Basketball players are taller, runners are faster, ice skaters more jumpy.
You made it happen. Simply by watching athletes, you can change them.
In the 1920s, the average offensive lineman was 6 foot and 211 pounds. In 2011, 6 foot 5 and 310 pounds. An average gymnast would have been 5 foot 3 30 years ago and is now on average 4 foot 9. And in the 1950s, a basketball player would have been 6 foot 4 and now on average is 6 foot 7. On average. That's not tall, that's high.
This is a low point.
Performances have changed too. They're faster, further, higher, and stronger.
Constant improvement is great and all, and I understand that's sort of the point, but what's actually fueling that drive?
In 1 year in the US, there are 127,000 hours of sports to watch. But it wasn't always like this. In 1883, Joseph Pulitzer bought a paper called the New York World, and sales went through the roof.
This increase in circulation is absolutely enormous. And of course, it's down to things like more sensational reporting and including pictures. But importantly, this newspaper was the first to have a devoted sports department.
The rise of modern sports is linked to working-class leisure time. You'd knock off from the factory and run around. Mostly you'd play for fun or something. I don't get it either.
And the expansion of print media was part of a huge change.
Radio and TV followed, driving the popularity of sports like baseball, boxing, and horse racing.
It's going to be a photograph finish, and it's anybody's race.
Now we have spectators, people who'll pay to see something extraordinary. The sports media business is now a billion-dollar industry, so doing sports today has higher stakes. It's literally an athlete's job.
There are a lot of factors which feed into sports improvement, whether it's increased fitness or advances in medicine or doping or a wider group of people to choose from and compete against. But there's just no getting away from the fact that it's our love of spectating which is changing the games we watch.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thanks for watching. Stay warm, and we'll see you tomorrow.